All right, we begin with participation. If I were to ask you what the oldest name for the city of St. Paul is, you would say, shout it out, Pig's Eye. Ah, the historians among us, this is good. Pig's Eye Landing was so named after Pierre Pig's Eye Parent, the first European settler to call this place home and the one with the most unfortunate of nicknames. This was the base of his less than savory and sometimes nefarious activities, but that's a sermon for another day. Later, wanting to bestow a little more respectability and a Christian name, Catholic missionaries would call this place St. Paul, after the famous saint of the same name whose writings comprise much of the New Testament. I asked this question at 8 o'clock, but forgot to say, what is the oldest name of the city of St. Paul? And so when I said the oldest name of St. Paul, they said, Saul! Which the Bible scholars are going to get. All right. But before colonial contact, this land had an even older name. Let me start again. Before colonial contact, this land had an older name, Imnizaska. I'm sure my pronunciation could do with some help. But that is the Dakota word for the white sandstone bluffs that skirt the river here near the intersection of the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers. Quite simply, translates white rocks. It is the translation for this older name because the cliffs upon which we now sit, high above the rivers, are easily recognizable at a distance, and therefore it was easy to name this place and to know what to look for. I tell you this name today in part because it is good for us to remember this place's history before colonization, that the descendants of that history are still here, some even in these pews this morning, despite every effort to eradicate them in their language, their culture, and their spirituality. I tell you that name too because it helps us to remember that to the first inhabitants of this land, and perhaps anew to us, the land that we occupy is sacred. It has a name. It has a meaning. But I also tell you the name for an even more specific purpose. If you are familiar with the facade of St. John's, which as you walk through these doors, I hope you are, then you know that the very same sandstone for which this place was originally named was broken and quarried to create this house in which we gather to worship. We are literally gathered here, surrounded by the broken pieces of the land our Dakota siblings call sacred. This story is not a unique story and one that I tell not to shame us but to inform us. It echoes the long history of whiteness and of colonialism that humans shaped in this mindset will take one good thing, one sacred and whole thing, and seek to divide, commodify, and reshape it into another thing as if we were the creator. Across much of human history, there is a theme that finds its apex and greatest perfection in Western thought, that seeks always to redefine the land, people, objects, and the contents of the land, the plants, the minerals, the waters, and the animals that dwell there, according to the value they impart to those who manage to lay claim to them. So we draw borders and boundaries. We draw up and dam rivers and remove mountaintops, all in the name of commerce, breaking what was to make it into what is. And so begins the story of mine and yours, the story of us and them. It is a story that we are slowly seeking to unlearn, a process of human formation that we are seeking to undo as we turn ourselves in this place anew to the Gospels, to the story there of healing and reconciliation made known in the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Of course, it's not uncommon for the church and for preachers like me in our discomfort at the knowledge of how large a part we have played in the story of breaking and of renaming, of colonizing and exploiting, to speak first of reconciliation. It's an easy out for a preacher who's a little uncomfortable. Reconciliation is that gift, that blessed and hoped for gift, achieved by no merit of our own, but given by the grace of God. So it is that many of us will speak first of this gift without naming the brokenness that it is meant to heal. It is hard to own. Some would say it is too debilitating and demoralizing to have to revisit the sins of which we are beneficiaries of and sometimes accomplices in. Which is why, much to our discomfort, the church in her wisdom has us begin with confession. Before we arrive at this table to experience reconciliation in the flesh, before we come here to eat and drink of this feast of grace, before we celebrate things like we even are doing now today in this season of creation, say the healing of the land, we first articulate in acts of confession things done and left undone, our lack of gratitude, as our prayers will say, our misuse of the land, and we acknowledge our responsibility to be participants and collaborators with God in the healing of the land and undoing the damage our sinfulness has caused. Our confession, like the gospel today, reminds us that our story has a different trajectory than the one our market economy and our body politic, our socially and racially divided world often intend for us. That trajectory reminds and promises that trajectory promises us, doesn't remind us because it wouldn't be true. It points us, yes, toward reconciliation, but it is a story that still includes the cross. Jesus tells the crowd and the disciples that following him and his way of love in the world involves taking up our cross. Now, theologians will rightly tell you that this passage is not meant as a call to embrace only the general suffering of the world, prone as that approach is to causing us to glorify suffering in and of itself. The gospel here is not just telling us to acknowledge illness, grief, struggle, and loss, universally experienced as they may be, but this call to take up our cross is a call to be prepared for the consequences that will undoubtedly come from following Jesus, the suffering that naturally results when we stand with the oppressed, the marginalized, and those on the outside. For to stand there is to stand in opposition to the narrative the world seeks to form us in. I would contend that the call to take up the cross actually includes both of these things. For Jesus came into the world as one of us, to experience the world as we do, the hurts and the pains, the griefs that we endure, and then as one of us, fully acknowledging the suffering present, he takes one further step to preach forgiveness in a world of vengeance, to preach peace in a world always at war, with just cause or not, to freely heal the sick and feed the hungry in a world that says food and medicine are commodities to be rationed. In short, Jesus' ministry of reconciliation pointed to the edges, to the places broken and wounded by human systems that seek to own and to commodify. Jesus' life and story draws our attention to places we'd like to pretend don't exist and confirms that here is where we must go if we are to follow him. And the cross is the only logical end to such a direct refutation of the story of the world to the processes of colonization and commodification. Now I know we're in a season where a campaign is afoot and an election is in front of us. And in a political season that seems hell-bent on further division and violence, and in a world where we just seem to drift further and further apart, it might be tempting to see only through the lens of winners and losers, to leave it all on the field, as one of our politicians said, to believe that power of the political variety will solve the problems that we face. And make no mistake, I believe, as I know most of you do, that the outcome of this election season is of vital importance to the fabric of our society, and that the costs of choosing the wrong leaders and their policies will have a lasting and possibly irreparable damage to our nation. I know that we as people of faith must engage in the civic life of our country with faithfulness and integrity, and that voting can be one way of putting our prayers to work. But at the same time, as followers of Jesus, I know that no matter the outcome of this election, the church and all of us with it will still be called to the same places we've always been called, the places Jesus ministered, pointed to, and preached about, to the broken places, and to the people broken by our systems of inequality and oppression, even democratic systems that we believe in and to which we work. We must be clear-eyed that the day after the election, and the day after that, and the day after that, there will be work to do to serve the poor, to welcome the immigrant, to feed the hungry, to visit the lonely and the forgotten, and to stand up for those whose bodies stand most to be harmed in a world of commodification and colonization. We will always be called to pick up our cross. But this morning at our forum, we said that one of the things we love most about St. John's is joy. And I don't know about you, but all of that leaves me feeling a little joyless. So do not lose hope. Do not lose heart. Be of good cheer and joy, for we have gathered. And know that it is by the cross of Jesus that reconciliation begins. We have been brought together and gathered and healed and restored in this place of all places, made of the brokenness of the land around us. And we know that we are restored here, and we know it in our very bodies. It is the cross that brings together heaven and earth and that unites us in right relationship with all those gathered around us, where humanity is healed. We know we may not ever replace these stones in the cliffs from which they were originally quarried, but they can stand as a reminder that God always calls us to minister with and to the broken, for we are also broken. We are called to proclaim healing, to live according to the way of Jesus, his way of love in the world, picking up our cross and following him no matter the cost. Amen.